Yes, Ms Scott.
Can we then have the interim report from the Ross Expert Working Group, HSOC 303349? Now we can see here that it's dated September 2002. We were looking before the break at the announcement of the response of the Scottish Executive to the Health and Community Care Committee report and the decision to commission this expert group. Were you concerned about the fact that we're now in September 2002 and you're only now getting a preliminary report with recommendations?
Not really. I mean, the original timetable was, I think, 6 months in July, so that's not a big difference, really.
Can we look at page 19, please, just to get, so that the subsequent questions are put in the context of what this group were recommending. We can see here this is the section where they are dealing with those who have contracted HIV or HCV as a result of receiving blood products or tissue transfer from NHS Scotland. And in the background they say this: we were asked to consider as part of wider consideration the situation of patients who have contracted HIV and or HCV from blood transfusion or treatment with blood products. Presently, people who have contracted HIV through receiving blood products or tissues from the NHS benefit from the arrangements via the Macfarlane and Eileen trusts, whereas people who have contracted HCV under exactly similar circumstances do not. We believe that infection with HCV brings about adverse effects for the people involved, similar those to experienced by people infected with HIV. Furthermore, the way in which people were infected with HIV was exactly the same. Sorry, HCV was exactly the same as those who became infected by HIV. We feel that this represents an inequity that should be addressed by introducing new arrangements. So just pausing there, we looked at a document this morning which suggested that the Scottish Executive's position was that HIV should be treated as a special case. Having received this report, did that position change?
Well, we were not closed to giving payments to people with HCV, so I suppose we still felt it was a different situation, but there could also be similarities.
And then if we go over the page, we can see the recommendations, 4.8. I'll just look at the first 4 of those. We recommend the following. The Scottish Executive should establish and fund a discretionary trust as a matter of urgency that will make ex gratia payments to all people who can demonstrate on the balance of probabilities that they received blood products or tissue from the NHS in Scotland and were subsequently found to be infected with hepatitis C virus as follows. A, an initial lump sum of £10,000 to cover inevitable anxiety, stress and social disadvantage. B, an additional lump sum of £40,000 to those who develop chronic hepatitis C. C, in addition, those who subsequently suffer serious deterioration in physical condition because of their hepatitis C infection, e.g. cirrhosis, liver cancer or other similar serious conditions, should be entitled to additional financial support on an ongoing basis if necessary, as may be assessed appropriately by the Trust. This financial support should be calculated on the same basis as common law damages, taking account of the payments made under A and B above. And D, where people who have received, where people who would have been beneficiaries of these arrangements are deceased and their death was not due to the hepatitis C virus, the above payments should pass to their executors. Where their death was due to the hepatitis C virus, the Trust should provide for payments to be made to dependent children, spouses, partners or parents as appropriate. And then it goes on to give recommendations about whether or not those that have received payments under legal liability should receive payments, and so on. And then if we go over to paragraph 4.9 on the following page, we can see that a further recommendation there, the Scottish Executive should consider how it could fund and develop other mechanisms for supporting people who suffer from HCV. In particular, additional support in the following areas should be considered: access to understandable information on HCV, counselling service, access to information on benefits, assistance with assurance and insurance, and setting up a proactive publicity campaign spearheaded by the Health Education Board for Scotland. So it's right to understand, is it, that what was being recommended at this stage in September 2002 were payments on 3 levels? So everybody who had been infected with hepatitis C would get £10,000, whether or not they managed to clear the virus spontaneously.
Yes, I mean, there's 2 issues really that pertain right through from the publication of the preliminary report right through to the end of January 2003. One is the level of payments that people are to receive, and 2 is who is to receive them. So the expert group and the parts that you've read out, I think, make clear their view in terms of how much is to be paid and who is to receive them. I mean, I note in passing they've bypassed the purpose for which they were set up, that is coming up with general criteria, and I don't complain about that. They tried, they were an excellent group. I picked the people on them, and I know they were excellent people, so they actually found it difficult, if not impossible, to come to general principles and criteria. They came to a similar view as the Health Committee, that we need to have basically here an ad hoc payment to these people. So that's obviously a very important conclusion that they came to. So from here on in, it's really how is the Scottish Executive going to respond in terms of who is going to get paid and how much they're going to get paid. And everything that happens between this moment of time in September 2003 and the 29th of January 2003 is the evolution of the Scottish Executive's approach to those 2 issues. And of course, the fundamental problem that I had,
can I just stop you there for a moment? The reason for doing it is just to ask you to slow down a bit. You naturally speak very fast. It is, I think, a bit of a problem for the stenographer who has to take down every word. So if you just bear him or her in mind now and again, I'd be grateful. It also helps us to follow everything you're saying, which is, of course, important.
So, Mr. Chisholm, shall I remind...
Sorry, Ms. Scott, please wait. You were in the middle of a flow. I've stopped you. Do you want to add anything to it? I'm sorry for interrupting.
So I was just going to remind him what he just said.
The issues will come up in questions anyway. Thank you. I'm sorry, I shall slow down. I shall try to slow down.
Thank you.
If it assists, I can read the transcript and remind you where you'd got to. You say everything that happened between this moment of time and September 2003 and 29th of January 2003 is the evolution of the Scottish Executive's approach to these 2 issues. And of course, the fundamental problem that I had, I would...
Oh, yeah. Yes, I mean, the fundamental problem, as I articulated then, and I'm doing so again now, is the affordability of these proposals. Obviously, we'll comment about who was to get money in due course, but the fundamental problem that I had was that I had many other policies and financial requirements in terms of the health budget. There were many problems in the health service at the time. I think in my written statement I gave the example of cancer services, which was the biggest issue I faced in my first few months as health minister, and there were well publicised problems, and £60 million over 3 years was allocated to the revamped cancer strategy. And I give that example now as I did then, just to put it in context, the up to 89 million that was being recommended by the expert group. And other ways of looking at that are health budgets then as now. Most of the budget is not something you can actually change, because it's to do with staff and buildings and medicines and so on. And the final example I think I gave in my written statement was that the unallocated reserve for everything in the health department for all unforeseen emergencies and such like was 25 million. So quite clearly a report that was recommended anything up to 89 million, possibly from 62 million as its lowest limit, was going to cause enormous problems for me in the health budget. So that was the fundamental problem that confronted me when I received the report.
So it's right to understand then that your thinking on receiving this report was the principle that there should be a compensation scheme is one that you agree with. The question then is, what's the scope?
I don't think we would have accepted the word compensation, which is why very soon the term ex gratia payment came into play. But it's fair to say that there was still resistance to the almost universal scope of the report in terms of who should receive payment, because the thinking in the executive at the time was that it was more looking like compensation if everybody received the payment. So the initial response, and in one indeed which persisted throughout the rest of 2002, was that payments should go to a subdivision of those people who had hepatitis as a result of blood products or blood transfusions, that it should go to those who were suffering long-term harm, and various other similar language was used. So that was certainly the response for most of the period, although that did change in January of 2003.
We'll come on to look at the evolution of some of the thinking about the scope of the scheme in a moment. But what would you say to those people that might say, well, you've commissioned an independent expert group with a wide range of expertise to give you some advice on this? You should implement their recommendations in full.
Well, I mean, I think that is a fair and understandable point. I mean, actually, the Scottish executive made very good use of expert groups, and I had experience of several when I was the minister, as I said in my written evidence, and paid very close attention to the people who were in them. There was great expertise in this group. The most well-known group of all was the David Kerr group on the reorganisation of health services, which again I chose very carefully, and they came up with an important report. But the one problem, the only problem I would say with expert groups, is when it comes to the financial recommendations, because clearly the expert group is not able to take into account the other funding pressures and priorities of the particular departmental budget. So that is the one problem that does arise from expert groups. But of course there was one other problem which I must refer to, which takes me back to the issue of medical advice, which I referred to earlier, because the medical advice I received was that it wasn't very easy to distinguish between Category 1 and Category 2. And although I think now with retrospect, I may think that was not necessarily foolproof advice, you will understand that at the time I was obliged to follow medical advice, and indeed on medical issues I don't think politicians can do otherwise.
And so what you're talking about there is the categories of beneficiaries that the Ross group were talking about. So if we could go back to the previous page we were just looking at on that report, we can see the category 1 is those that were found to be infected with hepatitis C, and category 2, those who develop chronic hepatitis C. So is it right to understand the medical advice you were given was that it was not easy to distinguish between those two groups?
Yes, I think that it was how would you know when chronic hepatitis was triggered? That's my understanding of the medical advice. The conclusion was clear anyway, that 1 and 2, A and B, as it is on that page, should be put together. And of course, the other very strong feeling in the executive at that time was that payment should not go solely on the basis of anxiety, stress and social disadvantage. And of course, that was the fundamental shift that I made in January 2003, where it was the one point where I quite clearly diverged from the executive civil service view on this. But at this point in time, I'm accepting, obviously, this there's a problem with distinguishing between those two categories, but the bigger problem is, where am I going to find £89 million or up to £89 million for?
And just going back to that point, the advice that you received about category 1 and category 2, or A and B, that was advice from within the civil service, was it?
Well, that was actually medical advice, and so that was why it could not really be challenged in terms of the diagnosis of various states of hepatitis C. I was not in a position to question that advice.
So, and advice from a medical advisor within the civil service?
Indeed.
Before we go on to look at the chronology of how this developed, I just want to take you to one paper to understand the basis upon which the figures for those that might be beneficiaries of such a scheme were arrived at. SCGV 301037_110. So this is a cabinet, a paper for the cabinet for a decision. It's a draft, and so I don't want to take up any time looking at the text of it. It's one of the annexes I want to take you to, but just so that we understand what it is, it's to seek agreement to a proposed Scottish executive response to the expert group's recommendations and endorsement of the expenditure entailed in that response. And then if you look at the bottom, it says options, and then it sets out the options. A, reject the recommendation outright, and it goes over the page to set out 4 different options. B, decline to respond to the recommendation until the group provides its view on whether the general approach should be changed. C, accept the recommendation in full, or D, accept the recommendation in principle but with a reduced scope. And if we then go over to the next page, there it says financial implications, paragraph 8, no allocation in current budget for this expenditure. Option C, which you will recall is accept the recommendation in full. It says lump sum payments are estimated at 62 million based on the original awards made by the Macfarlane Trust to HIV patients in 1992, but could range from 11 million to 265 million depending on assumptions. See Annex F. And it was Annex F that I wanted to take you to, which we can see is at page 15. So we can see here estimated cost of recommendation as presented to the expert group on the 28th of August. And then if we go over to page 18, at the bottom there we can see it's got health planning and quality, August 2002. So is it right to understand that this is a document that was provided by the department in August 2002 to the expert group to assist them in calculating the cost of their recommendations?
It may well be. I don't know what they gave to the expert group, but it looks as if it is that. Yes.
I just want to draw your attention to one aspect of this paper. It's page 15. Now,
I think the expert group took its own advice on terms of costings and numbers, as far as I understand it.
So that was so what I was trying to understand is where the numbers for those that might be beneficiaries came from. And
no, I think that the expert group took its own advice in terms of how the numbers and the cost. Yeah, that did not come, as far as in fact, I'm pretty sure it didn't come from departmental civil servants. They commissioned their own advice on that.
The expert group commissioned their own advice.
Yeah.
So anyway, while we're here, just to understand what the departmental view on numbers was, we can see number of eligible for payments down towards the bottom of the page there, and it's got blood and tissue patients and haemophiliacs divided between surviving and deceased. And for the blood and tissue payments, it's got footnote 1. And if we just turn over the page, we can see where that comes from. The paper attached as Annex B, which we don't have, was prepared by Dr. Kate Solden, epidemiologist at the Department of Health Public Health Laboratory Service, CDSC, following a specific request from the group secretariat. It amends calculations made for England, contained in a paper shortly to be published in Epidemiology and Infection, and attached as Annex C, to generate comparable figures for Scotland. Please note her statement about the assumptions she has used. Some of these are outlined in the original paper. And then it makes the point that it only considers HCV infection via blood transfusion. And then it sets out what the paper estimates in terms of figures, that in Scotland, the figure infected by blood transfusion is 3,498, and that 1,886 of those are considered likely to be deceased by 1995, leaving 1,612 possible survivors. And Brian McClellan, the clinical director at the SNBTS Clinical Services Unit, has advised that no more than 50% of the 1,612 should be assumed alive today. He believes that 50% is a high estimate because figures show that many of those infected will now be aged 80 plus, and also they are likely to have been seriously ill to have needed the blood transfusion in the first place. And so the estimate therefore approximates the number of survivors to 800, 50% of 1,612, and subtracts this from 3,500, 3,498, to give 2,700 as the number deceased. And so that's, is it your understanding that that is the genesis of the numbers of those that might be beneficiaries that both the expert group and the department were working from?
Well, certainly, particularly the reference at the top to Dr. Kate Solden, I knew that the expert group had commissioned her. So, I mean, I've read several different accounts of numbers and so on, but I'm going by what the expert group concluded. I mean, as you said, you would expect us to pay attention to the expert group having commissioned them.
And is it right to understand that her, well, we can see the basis of her numbers, that it's taken from numbers in England and then generating comparable figures for Scotland. Was, in your time, to your knowledge, any epidemiological assessment done in Scotland of the numbers that might qualify for the Ross payment?
Not to my knowledge, but as I say, I was following what the Ross committee said because that seemed to be the most comprehensive look at it at that period of time, but no doubt other work has been done since.
We can leave the Ross report for now, and I want to pick up the chronology next with the conversation that you had with Alan Milburn on the 4th of November 2002. But before I do, did you have any conversations with any other UK government ministers, such as Hazel Blears? Or was your only conversation at this stage with Alan Milburn?
Not in my recollection. I can only remember having a discussion with Alan Milburn.
So by the time that you were having a discussion with Alan Milburn on the 4th of November, had you already made a decision, you and the cabinet, that you were going to have a scheme of some sort?
We'd certainly decided that we were going to have a scheme of some sort, and I think the report was being published on the 6th of November, and I therefore had a conversation with Alan Milburn on the 4th of November, basically just indicating to him that in general terms, I was going to offer some kind of payment to at least some of the people affected in this way.
And did you come under pressure from Alan Milburn to take a different course?
Well, I mean, he certainly wasn't happy, and of course, I've already mentioned that whatever we proposed was going to have knock-on effect on other administrations. So, no, obviously he wasn't particularly happy about what we were proposing.
And did he try to change your mind?
Well, I think he obviously tried to, but I wouldn't say he was too heavy about it. I mean, obviously, we knew each other. He knew that I took a different view from him on several matters, so perhaps he just thought, well, here's another one. But yes, he did try to persuade me, but it didn't become acrimonious, I wouldn't say.
Can we just look at DHSC 004 2275_129? Now, this is an email from the private secretary of Alan Milburn to officials in Department of Health Blood Policy Unit. Now, this is dated the 4th of November. It's obviously not a document you would have seen at the time, but the inquiry has sent it to you, and it's a record of the telephone conversation, and I just want to take you through it and get your views as to whether or not it's an accurate record insofar as you can recall. Malcolm Chisholm said that off the back of a health committee, they had set up an expert group to look at the issue of Hep C in blood products. The expert group has now completed its report, which, according to Malcolm Chisholm, says that Hep C is comparable with HIV. If accepted, this would mean something along the lines of payments of 10k to people infected with Hep C via blood products and 40k at the point they develop chronic Hep C. Malcolm Chisholm is due back before the Health Committee on Wednesday and feels he has to offer something, probably around payments to people once they become seriously ill. SOS was very clear that he thought this would be a grave mistake, and that once the principle that we'd established had been breached, then we were scuppered and on a slippery slope to payments running into the millions across the UK. He said he thought Malcolm Chisholm needed to tough it out. Malcolm Chisholm said that the advice he had was that this was a devolved matter for the Scots. However, he wasn't sure this was right. SOS is very clear that we need to find some way of showing that the Scots don't have the devolved power to go it alone on this, and thereby prevent them going ahead with any kind of announcement on Wednesday. So, does that accord with your recollection in general terms of the conversation?
I mean, that seems to me to be quite an accurate report. And of course it raises, well, there were actually two other issues that were complicating this and were actually reasons why we had to take account of what the UK government's position was. And the first of those is mentioned there, because obviously if this was not a devolved matter, then it would be difficult, in fact impossible, for us to make any of these payments. And of course, the second problem, which led to my letter to the Department of Work and Pensions Secretary, Andrew Smith, the following day, was that there would be a problem if these payments were then clawed back from any social security benefit that the recipients were getting. So there were two unavoidable UK issues. So even people who thought, well, why are you even talking to the UK government, would have to acknowledge that none of this could be implemented unless we resolved the devolved power issue and the social security issue.
I'm not asking you about the content of the advice that's referred to there in that last paragraph, but is it right as a matter of fact that you had already received advice that this was a devolved matter, but you were unsure whether that was correct?
Well, I think we hoped it was a devolved matter, but I think we weren't entirely sure. I mean, it's a bit of a digression to go into all the different arguments about this, but it's probably well known that Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act has social security as a reserved issue. So the argument really is about to what extent is what we are proposing covered by that reservation, or can we argue that these are not fundamentally analogous to social security payments, that they're more general health payments or whatever. And one kind of defence of that was that the vaccine damages reservation in Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act is separate from the social security, which does suggest that health payments are not covered by social security. So this became part of our argument. But that's rather a complex, arcane point, and all of that was being discussed. So while we hoped it was a devolved matter, no, we couldn't be absolutely sure about it. And indeed, the following month, we changed the nature of our proposals because we were advised that lump sum payments were more likely to be regarded as within devolved powers. And that was one of the reasons that we changed. And in fact, that was not necessarily a bad change in any case, but we'll come to that in due course.
But the question that I was, is it right to understand that you had already received advice about this matter, about whether it was devolved or reserved, by the time you spoke to Mr. Milburn?
Well, I can't describe in detail what the advice was, but I think in general, I was told we think this is a devolved matter. We think it is, but clearly that was open to dispute. As we see from the minute, it was already being disputed by people in London.
So we see in the papers that a reference was made, a joint approach to the law officers in January 2003. Do you know why it took so long, if you're having this conversation with Mr. Milburn in beginning of November 2002, and this issue's in play, why it wasn't until January 2003 that an approach was made to the law officers for advice? Well,
I think this was being discussed all of the time, as far as I understand. So I can't say when the first approach was made, but it was certainly being discussed on an ongoing basis. But it may be that was because it was at that point that we knew exactly what we were talking about, because obviously it made a difference whether we were talking about monthly payments as we were in November 2002, or whether we were talking about lump sum payments as we were at the end of January 2003. So I think that's probably relevant to that question as well.
And did you ever get the impression that that Westminster was using the issue of whether or not the matter was devolved as a way of delaying or even frustrating the decision you've made to have a scheme of some sort?
Well, that may well have been the case, but I think it was such a grey area that you could hardly stand up and say, we know for certain this is devolved and that's what they're doing, because clearly it was a matter of legal dispute. And in fact, that is one of the reasons the main reason, in fact, why I wrote to Andrew Smith just before Christmas, saying we think it resolves the problem if we can make the lump sum payments instead of monthly payments. And as I think for other reasons, I was quite happy to propose that anyway, but that was the fundamental reason for that change. So I think it's fair to say it was a grey area, and I think that was exemplified by the McFarland fund payments, because they had to be specifically excluded as a factor to be taken into account in social security legislation. I'm sort of straying into the second issue when I say that, but it does illustrate the point that they were regarded as social security payments, and that, of course, would have been caught by the Schedule 5 reservation of the Scotland Act.
I'm not going to take you to the letter that you wrote to Andrew Smith, but for the record, it's WITN 6942015. Can we turn then to your appearance at the Health and Community Care Committee on the 11th of December 2002, which is at SCGV 40250_019. And we can see there this is a report of the proceedings there on the 11th of December. If we can pick it up at, I think your evidence starts at page 24. No, I think it starts at page 20. We can see at 11:04 there'd been a suspension of the meeting, and on resumption you appear with Mr. Stock and Mr. McLeod from the Health Department. I just want to look at the announcements that you were made on that occasion. If we can start at page 23. Yes. You say this: I said in my statement we want to concentrate help on those who are suffering, in the words of last year's Health and Community Care Report, serious long-term harm. That indicates that we want to target the support, and fortunately many people who contract hepatitis C either clear the virus or do not go on to develop symptoms that the majority of people do. We need to concentrate help on those who are suffering serious long-term harm. This is one issue, and we think that people understand it. And then you make some comments about the financial considerations. And then you go on at the penultimate paragraph of this page. And it starts: the committee's report argues we should follow the precedent of the McFarland Trust. But the people who received money through that trust were those who fell ill quickly, as happened with HIV in those days. So if we follow precedent, the one analogous trust that has been set up was targeted at people who were suffering physically. I believe that at the point at which physical suffering kicks in, help should be given, which is what I propose. And then at if we go on to page 25, you're asked some questions by Nicola Sturgeon at the bottom of that page. Which says, the Minister has continually used the term serious long-term harm. Will he define that? And then you say, I refer to physical symptoms. I said that in my statement. And so you making a clarification there that what you're referring to is physical symptoms, not psychological symptoms. Is that right?
At that point I was, but this was a pivotal moment for me. It's very uncomfortable for me reading this now, but the reality is it was uncomfortable for me saying it at the time, and I think it was partly my experience at the Health Committee that day that made me change my mind on this particular matter. I mean, and this is where I diverge from the civil servants and the orthodox view that I had inherited, because it seemed to me, I'm jumping slightly ahead, but you're quite right to highlight these features. But as I say, it's quite uncomfortable for me to read them now, because the reality is I soon came to the conclusion that we could not draw a line in this way and only ring fence support for people when they'd reached a certain state. I mean, it's very interesting if you read the briefing I received for this particular committee, and I noticed there was some reference to 40% of people with hepatitis C from these causes being excluded by the criterion of serious long-term harm. Although I was putting that line on the committee on the 11th of December, I very soon after became very unhappy with that, which is why it's very interesting to compare what I said on the 11th of December with what I said on the 29th of January. And clearly it's what I said on the 29th of January, which was the foundation of the Skipton Fund proposals, rather than what I'm saying here on the 11th of December, where I'm specifically saying serious physical symptoms. And it was even uncomfortable for me at the time, and I soon realized that I had to change direction on this.
And we'll come and look on what you say on the 11th of January. That just one point that I wanted to pick up with you, that one element of the scheme that you announce on the 11th of December that doesn't change is that the scheme is only going to be for those who are the hepatitis C sufferers themselves. So no payments to estates and no payments to dependents as recommended by the Ross Committee. Is that right?
Well, that's entirely a financial matter. I mean, as I've indicated, the two issues are how much are people going to get and who's going to get it. And if you have, as I had, there's no way I could find from the health budget the sums of money that were required by the Ross report. So it's perhaps a fairly understandable decision to make. It is let's concentrate support on people who are still alive. But yes, clearly it would have been desirable to implement the Ross report in full, but there is simply no way that that was possible within the health department budget. I mean, I think it's difficult for people to remember the context, because although the health budget was increasing, it was not increasing by the same amounts as it did in the latter half of that particular decade. And there were simply very hard financial decisions to make. And that's the fundamental driver of the decisions that we had to make at that time.
Lord Reid, when he gave evidence to the inquiry on this point, on the fact that the Skipton Fund didn't provide assistance to dependents, so that that was a matter of regret for him. Is that a view you would share?
Well, it's a matter of regret for me that I didn't have the money to implement the Ross report in full, but I just didn't have the resources to do that, and that's just the way it was.
If we move then to January 2003, if we can start with JEVA, 40143. Now this is a minute or a submission dated the 14th of January 2003 to you. And if we look at the bottom, it's from it's redacted, but it's from somebody in the Health Planning and Quality Division. Is the writing, a handwriting, yours?
Oh, yes.
It is. So what appears? We'll have a look at the what I think is appended to what's appended to the paper in a moment. But does this say I don't agree with the cabinet paper? There are
many more options.
Many more options, and
we need one that is affordable.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, but the word I'm seeing above that is unsustainable, because that's reminding me of the conversation we've just had, because basically we're still getting this line that help has to go to those who are suffering serious long-term harm, which it obviously has to do. But I was feeling very strongly in January 2003 that it was unsustainable to exclude other people who had contracted hepatitis C in this way and were suffering perhaps in a different way without the serious long-term harm. So that's the main word that strikes me there. But clearly it has to be affordable as well, because all the conversations we're having, not just in January 2003, but in the months before that, are we haven't got the money to pay anything like what Lord Ross is proposing. And in fact, if we jump ahead in 2 weeks' time, I'm told that I can't even can't even afford the £25,000 that we've agreed that goes to everybody who's got the virus in this way, because it's not affordable. So basically, that's the context for this: affordability and fairness to all of the people who have the virus in this way.
So the Cabinet paper, if we look at page 3, for example, of the Cabinet paper, sets out some options, payment to survivors at the levels recommended by the expert group, depending on the severity of symptoms, 10k plus further 40 to all with long-term symptoms or damage, plus further 50k to those with cirrhosis, liver cancer or other similar serious conditions. So that £50,000 was the estimate, was it, of what Lord Ross had said should be common law damages for that third group of people with the cirrhosis and liver cancer?
I think so, yes.
And then the estimates of the costs are given there. And then option 2 is a payment only to those who contract cirrhosis, and option 3, payment to those with long-term symptoms or damage. So is it right to understand that what you're saying, the position that you were in as of 22nd of January was that we can't afford any of these options, those don't even get to go to Cabinet for decision, give me some affordable ones?
No, I think we could afford option 2, and I think, I mean, it's a very interesting paper that you're putting up, which in some ways seems inconsistent with what happened subsequently in terms of we can't even afford the 25,000. But I suspect the reason for this paper is to steer not just me but the Cabinet towards option 2, which of course would be totally unacceptable, because it then is focusing support on far too narrow a range of people. But in terms of the sums of money that we were talking about, I think eventually I said I could find 15 million or so from my budget. Then obviously option 2 is the one that's most consistent with that.
So this was the paper that you rejected as being unaffordable. So we have another paper.
Well, unaffordable and unsustainable.
Unsustainable.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the limitation of the people covered by it.
Before we move on, can we just go back to the previous page? Thank you. If we look at the discussion part of the document, I noticed in passing that it says this, the last 2 lines, taking account of the fact that we now understand that DWP officials are now firmly of the view that a scheme to make ex gratia payments would be reserved. Your marginal note, I think, says, can we just have a look, please, at the whole screen? Thank you. Says, if I read it rightly, you can tell me if I've got the writing correct.
Sorry.
You ought to know. Also, when did we hear that DWP lawyers, law officers, I should say, had come to a view it was reserved?
Well, it is another strange feature of this draft paper. I have to say it's one of the strangest documents that you sent me. Possibly it takes the prize for the strangest document. And I think that is another interesting statement in it, because are some of the options being presented because they're thought to be not going to happen anyway, because this is a reserved issue. So we can, I find it a very odd paper, and you've honed in on one of the strange features of it, because I don't think there was a definite view. Indeed, we'd moved towards lump sum payments to get round this issue of reserved issues. So it was all round a very, very strange paper, and that is another feature of it that's very odd.
I wonder if I may just ask Ms. Scott. Ms. Scott, the evidence which we've heard so far about the legal position, the question whether it was a social security payment and therefore reserved, or whether it was a health payment and therefore devolved, it has been that when the law officers in Whitehall were asked, they said it's devolved. Have we heard at all that the DWP lawyers or department firmly took a view that it wasn't? I know they were investigating it, but I hadn't understood from the evidence we'd heard that they'd ever reached a firm position that it was reserved.
So I think that's right. Whether or not there is any such evidence that at some point the DWP did take that view, I don't know. I would have to check.
Well, if so, could you check? Because if so, if I'm right and there is no such evidence, someone's made this up somewhere for some reason, perhaps. It's come from somewhere. As you say, Mr. Chisholm, it's a rather odd statement, and that's why I just wanted to ask about it. Thank you.
If we then turn to the it's dated the same day, but what looks like the paper that provides more sustainable and affordable options as per your instruction, it's SCGV 40251_034. And we have, again, Scottish Cabinet paper for decision to agree the presentational approach for my further appearance before the Health and Community Care Committee on 29 January to decide on the type of ex gratia payment scheme the Executive would wish to establish if associated legal and social security issues can be resolved. And then you say that you've been asked to appear before the committee, but UK ministers have, however, yet to reach a conclusion on the issue of devolved powers. And then you set out some, if we go to the bottom of the page, scheme design, and at paragraph 7 you say this: I believe, you've set out what the expert group's view is, and you say, I believe instead that the scheme should be targeted at those who are still alive and who are experiencing long-term symptoms or signs of liver inflammation. The category most seriously affected are those suffering from cirrhosis, liver cancer or liver failure. Whilst it's possible to construct a scheme that would only make payments to individuals who had reached that stage, I do not believe it's realistic or fair to do so. And then you set out a number of options for the Cabinet to consider. And you say options at levels recommended by the expert group, £50,000 to all with long-term symptoms or damage, plus further 50 to those who develop cirrhosis. So that's, is it 10 to the first category, the expert group considered, 40 to the second, and then another 50 to the third? Is that how you have calculated that? But only to those who come within category 2 and 3, because it wouldn't be for everybody.
So which option are you referring to there?
Option 1.
Oh,
so,
yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then option 2, £35,000 to all those with long-term symptoms or damage, plus a further £35,000 to those who develop cirrhosis. Or option 3, £25,000 plus £25,000. And you then make the point that lump sum awards are proposed for the reason you've given earlier, that it might be easier to disregard those for social security purposes. And then you make the point at paragraph 9 that all of the options have significant financial implications. And then you say at paragraph 10, on that basis, I can only support option 3. I would be willing to provide up to £10 million in the next financial year, 0304, to meet these costs, and I accept that amount would be for the health budget to meet, but I could not find any more than required to fund this option. If any of the options are pursued, difficult decisions will be required about stopping other activities or developments with a potential impact on executives' priorities and targets. And then if we go over the page at paragraph 12, we can see what you say there. It would be helpful if I could say a little more to the committee about the type of scheme and criteria we have in mind. I have, in effect, already broadly outlined to the committee our preferred approach, and we should not at this stage be completely specific about what we do propose and the costs, in case this further raises expectations of what we will be able to do. And then you say, clearly we cannot make any payments if we do not have the legal powers to do so. And then you're inviting your cabinet colleagues in the conclusion to agree to base the design of a scheme on option 3, the 25 plus £25,000, and endorse your handling line for the committee, as you've set out there. In other words, to give them more information, although not to be totally specific about the scheme. So that seems to be the position on the 22nd of January. Does that accord with your recollection of what you went to Cabinet with?
Well, I think what's not explicit in the paper, it's our old friend, what is the definition of long-term harm? Because by this stage, I have come to the conclusion that really is anyone who has the virus. And that is, of course, what causes the as it were, the follow-up to this, which I'm sure you'll come on to, when I was told that no, if you want to give to all who have the virus, we can't afford £25,000, which is why perhaps you'll put up that paper in a minute. So this was not made explicit in the cabinet paper, but clearly this is the fundamental issue now about is everybody who has the virus going to get these payments, which what I announced a week later, or is it still going to be a limited category of those? So the 25,000 is agreed, yes, but the officials come back and say, but you're saying you want to give it to everyone with the virus. Now we're telling you that's costing too much, so you'll have to change that to 20,000. And there's a separate minute which records how that was agreed with the First Minister's approval.
So let's look at that. That's SCGV 40251_018. If we go to page 2, please. You can see that's dated it's from Bob Stock, dated the 29th of January to you. And we can see at paragraph 1, to record and confirm the decision taken today to inform the Health and Community Care Committee that the Executive would be prepared to fund a scheme that would make lump sum payments to those who now have hepatitis C as the result of receiving blood products or tissues from NHS Scotland. And then if we look at paragraph 3 and 4, a brief discussion was held at Cabinet at which it was agreed that £25,000 would be paid to those currently alive with hepatitis C as a result of blood products, and a further £25,000 to those who develop cirrhosis. We have now further reviewed the costings and numbers currently known to have hepatitis, and have concluded that this goes beyond what would be affordable if we are to make payments to all who currently have the virus. We have therefore costed a scheme on the basis of making lump sum payments of £20,000 to all those who now have hepatitis C, with a further £25,000 to those who have cirrhosis, liver cancer or liver failure. This was put forward with the agreement of the First Minister to the committee today. So that is what you were just telling us about a moment ago, is it?
Indeed, yes. No, that's an important follow-up to the Cabinet, absolutely.
And just to be clear, what you were talking about in terms of that first payment was to all those people who currently have hepatitis C, irrespective of their level of symptoms. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, which was the foundation of the Skipton Fund, although obviously it didn't go far enough in terms of the evolution of who gets the payment. That was a key moment because it suddenly opened it out. I don't know if you're going to cover the actual committee on the 29th of January. My first statement in the committee on the 29th of January was actually, my thinking is that I would like to give a payment to everyone who contracted hepatitis C from blood products and who is still alive. Now that actually went further than what I then went on to keep repeating everyone who has the virus now and is alive, because of course the issue that was not yet covered was what about people who had the virus but for this reason, but then cleared it either by treatment or spontaneously, and obviously that had to be clarified and developed later on in 2003. But the turning point, well, it's actually the starting point of the Skipton Fund was this announcement, but it was also a turning point because it was opening up the possibility of a much wider range of people getting the payments than had been envisaged in the initial response to the Ross report, or indeed in the thinking of the Scottish Executive at the time. So that, I have to be honest about this, I'm not trying to criticise any civil servants, but the reality is this was the point at which there was a divergence, a critical divergence between my views and the Cabinet's views and the civil servants, and we decided that we wanted to open out the payments to a wider range of people, although clearly that had to become wider still before the Skipton Fund was finalised a year or so later.
So let's just have a look at that announcement on the 29th of January. RLIT, 301091. And as you say, this is a transcript of your appearance before the Health and Community Care Committee. If we can just pick it up at page 21, where the discussion on hepatitis C begins, and we can see that you are appearing there, and you say this, there are two sides to the matter. First, we have been working on what we would like to propose in detail, the principles of which I outlined before Christmas. The second side is our discussion with the Westminster Government, and then you say, let me start with the first. And then if we go over the page to page 22, that second paragraph on the left-hand side, my thinking is that I would like to give a payment to everyone who contracted hepatitis C from blood products and who is still alive. I propose the payment of a sum of £20,000 to everyone who is in that position. I still intend to follow the expert group's thinking about a further payment at the cirrhosis or more advanced stage of the illness. This is consistent with what I said before Christmas. I propose that £25,000 should be paid at the advanced stage. And then you go on at page 25. Yes, so the paragraph beginning, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon suggested that I had narrowed down what the expert group proposed. However, in some ways I have expanded what the group proposed. I am saying that anybody who contracted the hepatitis C virus in that way will get £20,000, which is double what the expert group proposed for the group of people who have pre-chronic hepatitis C. I hope that I have simplified the recommendation and presented a proposal that everybody readily understands. It focuses on those who are alive who contracted the virus in that way. There are two levels of payment, and the proposal is easy to implement. We do not have grey areas between those who have chronic hepatitis and those who do not, as would have emerged from the expert group's proposals. We do not want to get involved in carrying out liver biopsies on hundreds of people. So, as you say, a development here in terms of who would be eligible for the payment, anyone that is alive who has contracted hepatitis C. Does that include those that had contracted hepatitis C but had cleared it by this date?
That's the problem that I highlighted. Although my initial statement said that, I then went on to say people who are alive and have the virus now. So that was a grey area from this committee. I fully accept that and take responsibility for that. But considering I was already making, as it were, quite a big step forward from what the executive had been saying hitherto, it was probably as far as I could go on this particular occasion. But obviously that did get sorted out later in the year in terms of people, well, not totally sorted, because there continued to be an issue about where the line was to be drawn. There was no doubt about people who had cleared the virus as a result of treatment, but there was a greyer area about those who had cleared the virus spontaneously, and I think eventually there was a dividing line between those who had suffered for a period with it and those who hadn't. So there continued to be issues about where the line would be drawn. I pushed it forward, but in terms of clarifying people who had contracted the virus and cleared it, I accept that I did not firmly establish that line at the committee. What I was drawing a definite line about here was anyone who has the virus now will definitely get payment, and that line had to be pushed further back a bit later in the year.
So just so that I can understand your evidence, are you saying that at the committee in January 2003, your announcement was limited to those who had the virus at that time?
Well, I think that is, I'm actually saying both things at different times, which you can criticise me for doing. It's probably an issue when you're speaking unscripted and perhaps haven't decided it. But I think the reality is the official position was anyone, and the simple position was anyone who is alive and has the virus now. I was kind of prefiguring that further development, but I obviously didn't present that systematically, so that development really had to take place formally a bit later on.
So, although, is this fair? Although if you look at the terms of what you said at the committee, it looks as though you were announcing that anyone who had contracted the virus would receive a payment. But that's not, in fact, what the position was.
Well, it's quite interesting that nobody at the committee actually picked up on this issue to question me, and I'm not even sure that anybody picked me up in the media reporting of it. But I think it would be fairer to say that in terms of, if you look at the whole transcript of the committee, although I didn't express it exactly as I should have at the points that you're referring to now, I think the headline of what I was saying was, if you have the virus now, you'll get the payment. And I think the other issue really was a bit of a grey area following the committee. So I wasn't trying to present something that wasn't the case. I think I just was not really expressing myself entirely accurately at those other points when I used the past tense rather than the present tense. And as I say, it's perhaps surprising that nobody picked me up on that in the committee, because the general response in the committee to what I said was very positive, including some nice complimentary words from Nicola Sturgeon. But I think looking back, I should have been a bit more careful about my use of the past tense there, although indeed I would have wished to include everyone who had it and had cleared it, but that had not been explicitly as it were, approved at that particular point. So I was almost straying beyond what had been officially agreed in terms of, if you have the virus now, you'll get the payment.
So, sorry to press this point, but just to be clear, whatever words were used, is it right to understand it in this way? It wasn't your intention to announce that the payment of that first payment of £20,000 would be for anyone who had contracted the virus, whether or not they had it in the present time.
No, I don't think that was explicit, because clearly there are some difficult issues to sort out about where the line was drawn, and those had to be sorted out within the next few months. So that work had not been done. So in that sense, I may have been expressing an aspiration, but I should have confined it, as I did for most of my statement, to those who have the virus now. And I think that's how it was understood, to be fair, but you can certainly criticise me for some inaccuracies in my use of tense.
And just one more question on this document before we probably break for lunch, and it's this. You announced the figures of £20,000 and £25,000, and we've seen the decision-making process which led to you being able to do that. How fixed, in your view, how fixed in your mind were those figures? Were they figures that could be changed as a result of submissions or further evidence later on, or were they the figures that you were saying the scheme will provide?
Well, obviously there was nothing to stop. I think those figures have been changed, but perhaps after several years, but there was nothing to stop those figures being changed at any point subsequently, because, and that's why, in a sense, the most important thing from my point of view was to extend the scope of the scheme, and then those figures could potentially be built on. But obviously I was saying what was affordable to me in terms of my budget at that particular time, but there is no reason why those figures couldn't have been doubled or whatever people wanted to do with them in any subsequent year. And as I say, I think more recently they have been increased, but it took quite a long time, in fact, for that to happen, I think.
So I don't know if now is an appropriate time to take a lunch break.
Yes, it is. We'll take a break until 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.
Thank you very much.